So we are live. Um, Hello, everyone, and I'm going to go ahead and be speaking about AGI today. If you have connected already, John will not be able to join us. He's got a bit of a cough, which it makes it difficult for him to speak for a length of time. So I will be carrying on with the topic. If somebody can give me a thumbs up that you can hear the audio, that would be great. I'm trying to catch here the comments. I believe that I am broadcasting already. I have 45 seconds or so of live broadcast. And once again, if you're just joining us, the topic for today is AGI. And I'm going to go ahead and pause here for 30 seconds or so to let people log in and to get a confirmation that we are, in fact, live. In fact, I can go to LinkedIn myself and check. Let me go ahead and check that just to make sure that we are broadcasting. And yeah, here we go. Okay, so thanks for the thumbs up, and I can see the comments coming in. So, as I mentioned, today we're going to be talking about AGI, and there are three questions that I want to address. And just to give you some context, I will be speaking for about 15 to 20 minutes, and then we can open it up for discussion. And I'll be able to take your questions. Also, feel free to ask questions along the way. I can pick those up as well. So the three questions that I wanted to address, or the three topics, is one, what is AGI? We talk about it quite a bit, but as you will see, I will argue that many times we're not talking about the same thing. The second one is when it comes to our current work and our current endeavors as humans, are we asking too much of humans? And again, I will make my argument for that. And the last one is to speak briefly about regulation and what that means. So let's go ahead and get started. I want to go ahead here and jump into the topic and put forth a definition of AGI. If you look at the literature, there's in fact quite a wide spectrum of interpretations for what AGI is, but I went with one of the most commonly used ones. And as you can see here, it defines an AI system as something that can learn, that can reason, and can apply its intelligence as broadly and as flexible as a human can. And so if we think about a individual human, and we think about what we know about ChatGPT, we can certainly make an argument that it can learn. We can make an argument that it can reason. And as to being able to apply its intelligence to many domains, no human can really do that, right? We tend to specialize in one. And so one of my arguments will be here that we're not that far away from achieving AGI. And so when it comes to this artificial general intelligence, I will argue that it's within reach. And recently, on the first days of the year, Altman made a post, a blog post, where he stated, we're now confident we know how to build AGI as we have traditionally understood it. And not only that, he makes an argument beyond that, that this year there will be agents, and you can think of agents as a collection of tasks that an AGI or an LLM can carry out as being something that would be the equivalent of a full-time employee. And that these systems will join companies and will change the output of these companies. And in many ways, you can see how that could be, right? These are not traditional employees. They don't get tired. They perform pretty consistently. And it is something that, brings some questions to mind. And as I thought about this, I thought, well, what do we have at the moment and how far are we from this? And it turns out that there's quite a bit there already. For example, if you think about automated inventory control systems, systems where you have drones flying up and down the aisle and scanning tags and being able to report at higher accuracy and much more frequency than the equivalents that we've had in the past. For those of you who know, warehouse management is a field unto itself. But you could see here how that entire effort, that used to be completely human driven in the past, all the way from bringing in the shipments to organizing them to keeping track of them, could now be fully automated. You could have robots that carry these goods in. You could have inventory control through software and through scanners as drones, right? And we've already seen the case of Klarna, where 600 human agents were replaced with an AI. And not only did customer support not suffer, it improved. And so we're starting to see some of these agents taking place in the marketplace. The other huge examples would be that of proteins, right? That the the effort from Google or Google founded with when it came to being able to discover new proteins. They were able to discover more proteins than have been discovered in the entire history of humanity using these techniques. So clearly we have some of that here already. And in some cases, we have it here fully. If we think about autonomous cars, there are a number of cities already in the United States where you have this service being provided, namely San Francisco and Austin. And it'll only be a matter of time before it comes to many other cities, right? And we're starting to see systems like ChatGPT outperform doctors. And if you've heard me talk about this before, I won't go through it here again. But that's already something that, when it comes to diagnosis, that there's evidence, empirical research that shows that this can be done. So, what is this next future? And you're starting to see it already. This is one of the arguments that I would make. And you can see here that Devon, a software engineer system that is being introduced, that was introduced this past year by Cognition Labs as the first AI software engineer that you could hire. Like, you can hire an individual, but you could hire it from a company and would perform the tasks of a software engineer. And in this case, I've seen the demos and I've seen some of what it can do. And I would say this is the first generation and will get better as time goes by, but it's not really here. The ones that I mentioned before, all of those are here and fully here. Now, so this is the context of AGI, something that can learn, something that has flexibility, much more than the empirical code that we wrote in the past that was much more rigid. And we can see that we could do that. But what about this concept of superintelligence? And I must admit, in the past, when people talked about AGI, I thought about this supreme entity, right? That could answer any question and do anything for you. But it turns out that the classical definition of AGI is a lot more reasonable, and it's in fact quite achievable. And in some cases, we're there already, right? But what is this superintelligence? And in this case, I would point you here to a couple of comparisons, right? If we define AGI as human level intelligence, right? Take your average human, could an AI do that? And I think I've made an argument to say that yes, we can. Then think about superintelligence as a collection of these average humans, all of them network, that can do a great deal more. And so you can imagine that even if we had humans and each of them specialized in something different, and you brought them all together in a network and you could access all of their brains at the same time, you'd have a pretty awesome type of intelligence. And that's what, informally the definition is. So beyond human intelligence, you can see here, my illustration on that. And interestingly enough, as I mentioned, Altman made that post at the beginning of the year saying AGI is now within reach and quite at hand for that. And now you can see here him making a statement that many companies are now moving beyond AGI to superintelligence. And so, I see here a question from the comments. Let me go ahead and pause and read it. And Kurt Larson says, AGI is a tipping point. I agree, on the horizon, and I think we can all wrap our minds around the concept and integrate it into processes. But can you prognosticate how long it will take for AGI, 10x or AGI 100x? And I think that's one of those things that it's unclear at the moment. If you think about the vehicle on the road, it is bringing together a number of things, right? It is bringing together the ability to navigate safely, or at least safer than humans have in the past. It is also bringing together the ability to be able to schedule pickups and be able to transport humans. And so it is in its end perhaps doing two or three of these, but it's certainly not doing 100 of these, right? And so how soon can we get there? I think that's something that we will find out in the years to come, but certainly is something that, again, within the definitions that I have given, AI companies are now focusing on super intelligence. So I wanted to now, I said I would address three different topics, right? And so this is sort of the context of how I think about AGI, some of the classical definitions, what superintelligence might be. And now I wanted to talk about where we are as humans. And I wanted to talk about this human edge, right? And so this is a picture that's often shown when it comes to farming. And I think many of us would recognize and would say, we should not go back to this. This is something that a machine can do, right? But when it comes to other human endeavors, we tend to think of them as somehow core to our humanity. If we think about writing, for example, and at one point, by the way, if we go back a couple hundred years, many people would say that about farming, being able to touch the earth, being able to plant the seed. It's such a strong connection and such a strong bond, and I still have this romantic notions of what that might be. But at the same time, if you look at farming of today, it looks nothing like that. Nothing at all, unless you're doing it as a hobby, right? And you look at the percentages of farmers today, they are around 3% and dropping. And if you look at it back a couple hundred years, it was about 90% of the population. So something that we felt was profoundly human, now we think of as something that machines can do at high scale much better than human. But as I mentioned, writing is something that we tend to think of as deeply human. And in fact, I wanted to read to you this quote here that says, writing a book is a horrible, exhausting struggle, like a long bout of some painful illness. One would never undertake such a thing if one were not driven by some demon whom one can neither resist or understand. And my point here being is that this is a really difficult thing to do, to be able to produce something that really brings together our insight and our understanding and can capture, patterns that perhaps are universal, like the great works of literature, right? And writers have gone crazy trying to do these things, right? But we do many other things that are quite as hard. So, for example, to be able to achieve success, say mid career as a computer scientist, how many hours have you invested in learning and mastering and continuing to grow? I think 30,000 hours may be a rough estimate. If you were to think about an elite training for a pianist, right? The kinds that go to conservatories and that are training in the multiples of hours, even below the age of 10, this would be around 40,000 hours. If you were to think about training when it comes to medicine, in the United States systems, doctors at high talent spend about 20 years training for their specializations that they focus on. And if you were to gather a number of these, think about the amount of time that and experience that they would bring together. And yet, as I mentioned before, or as I mentioned that I had mentioned, those of you who hear me often know that I've talked about, the test of ChatGPT when it comes to diagnosing between them and doctors. And the score wasn't close. It was 90%, over 90% to about 71 or 72%. And so you can see here that at least at one aspect of this training, these AI systems can actually do better. And so my question here, and this is a rhetorical question, is, are we asking too much of humans? Are we perhaps doing a poor fit from the demands that we place upon working professionals? Is this a healthy thing for humans? How many of us can really do this level of specialization, right? And the other thing that complicates this is that we have a lot of limitations. Again, if you've listened to me before, I've brought up, our ability to be able to keep track of things, that it's quite limited, 7 plus or minus 2, also known as Miller's Law. When it comes to our judgment, Kahneman, the Nobel laureate, has written about it extensively. We are inconsistent. It depends on what type of day, what day of the week and what time of the day that you get, say, a doctor. You may get a different response, or a judge. And if you want to perhaps uh, scare yourself a little bit about your reasoning capabilities, you can go to Wikipedia and read the list of cognitive biases that we have and see all of our multiple and long list of limitations that we have. And so when it comes to this, right, we have addressed a lot of this with hyper specialization. But as we do so, like the author of Range, the book Epstein wrote, do we then become more likely to be replaced by an AI, right? Remember, we started with our definition of AGI as artificial general intelligence, type of capability that you can bring to many domains. But if you narrow it, it's even easier, many of us would argue, to be able to replace the human with hyper specialization, right? And you don't have to consider everything there is. You're just after one specific task. And so as a strategy, as humans, right, is this a good way to spend our time? And so my my argument here is that the future is already here. It's not just evenly distributed. And this is a quote, of course, from Gibson that many people use. And one of the interesting things that I heard recently in the last 2 weeks is the statement that says AI will soon help our children to do things that we can't. And for those of us who have kids and know the ease with which they use technology, we can see that that is true. If there are systems that have AGI type capabilities and they're absorbing them or integrating them into their life, and it's becoming second nature to them, they will be better at this than we are. And so this is something that is coming. And this is why I have the following set of diagrams. Think about this, right? A child plus an AI will be better than a parent. And if we think about that in the workplace, think about the human plus AI being better than the human. As I have said in my courses, you will not be replaced by an AI. You will be replaced by a human using an AI. And likely, and this is more interesting as well, is that the human plus the AI will be better than the AI, because then we're leveraging human capabilities in addition to those of the AI. And think again about that fit. If we are specializing, hyper specializing, like I made the argument for, then we're becoming AI like, and we're not bringing really our human characteristics to that, right? And so ultimately, the win-win is human plus AGI. And when the question comes, what is best performed by people? This is sort of a sliding scale, right? It used to be that there were many tasks that you would say, absolutely not. This is purely the domain of the human. But that will change as time goes by. Today, if you were to ask me things such as empathy, ethics, leadership, complex judgment, and the ones I have listed here would be the ones that I would argue are good fits for humans. So let me go ahead here and end up by mentioning just a little bit about regulation, and then I'm happy to take your questions. And the first thing that I would mention is that is that example that some of you may know, and that is the UK's reaction to cars back in the 1800s. And this is also an effort to sort of end here in a light note. If you're not familiar with this, the UK responded with the 1865 Red Flag Act when they saw the possibility of cars being able to travel the roadways, which up until that point had only been carriages or horses. And so they put in three demands as part of these regulations, right, or this act. And the very first one, believe it or not, is that they would have a person. In other words, if you were operating a vehicle, you were required to have a flag bearer, as you see in the picture here, walk ahead of the car to warn others of this car coming down the road, right? The second one was that as a driver, you needed to yield to horses, right? Horses had the right of way. And if you encounter one, you had to pull off to the side. And the third one was that you couldn't drive more than 4 miles per hour, right? Otherwise, you would run over the flag bearer in front of you. That's about the average speed of a human walking casually. So obviously, and this is an illustration of the time, that seems completely crazy now. And in retrospect, many people talk about this being one of the causes why the U.S., who did not lead the innovation of cars at the at the beginning of this history, became actually the one that dominated the world's market. But this is really, just sort of a silly example of the kind of thing that you can criticize when you talk about bad regulation. Obviously, there are good regulations that we can point to. The Clean Air Act is one of the ones, in the context of vehicles that many people talk about. And when it comes to AI, I think even here at the outset, one of the things that I would point to would be the equivalent of the digital divide. That how do we make this available to everyone if this becomes now the way by which work gets done and the differentiator between nations, right? And so, as the last thing I wanted to mention here, that really, how do you compete in this new world means chips, energy, which many people will call compute, data, and talent. And so, my question to you would be, what is your strategy, right? And this is my last one. I'll go ahead and pause here, and we can open it up and we can run, say, 30 minutes or so. Um, and I'm going to go ahead here and come back to my picture full size. And so I'll be happy to take your questions or comments. I can see them here clearly. So please go ahead and post, and I'll go ahead and answer your questions. So let me go ahead and scroll back here. And I have one that is a comment or a question. It says, the AI agent evolution is going from collaborative agents work with humans to achieve a goal to reactive agents respond to stimuli, make situational decisions without humans. I think there will always be some of that. And this is a little bit like what has happened when it comes to trading in Wall Street. It used to be that the majority of the workforce for Wall Street, trading houses, was humans. And if you look at it now, it is the minority, right? However, you still have them, and you still have people building models. And we've seen some of this when it came to, say, the industrial age, right? As we move from human assembly plants to fully automated factories, right? And so I think we'll always have some of that. But I'll point you here to my experience when it came to outsourcing in the world of software. Shortly after 2000, as India was growing and becoming a viable destination for outsourcing work, many people in the American software engineering industry were quite worried. They thought all of the work would go to India, and American software engineers would do very poorly, right? And in fact, the opposite has happened. The work has grown so much that the US salaries continue to go up, meaning that the demand not quite accommodates, or the supply doesn't quite accommodate the demand that we have in the marketplace. And software engineers have done really well, in fact, better than most software engineers around the world. And so when it comes to our need for automating our work and being able to build new new systems to be able to respond to demands that we see in the market or the opportunities that we see in the market, many would argue, and I would argue that as well, is that it's endless. It's a little bit like startups, right? There will always be new ideas that are trying to pursue some new opportunity. And when it comes to building systems, the same thing will be true. Now, will you be able to do the same work that you did, say, 10 years ago? That will have to change as well. Much like on the flip side, the non-technical side, some jobs will disappear, right? And, here we can point back to the elevator operators, right? We don't see any more of those, right? They used to operate mechanically the elevators and people would come in and out. And now it's fully automated, right? And some of that will happen. And this is just part of that transformation. And I don't mean to make light of it. I know that it is challenging. And in many places, this will be a crisis in that reskilling that needs to happen. But I would argue here as well that we've been there before, right? I talked about that transition from the agricultural economy to the industrial economy. That happened in the United States around 1910, where only about 30%, actually, it was even smaller. It was only about 10% of people went to high school, right? And within 30 years, that number was well above 30%. And within 40 years or so, it was up to 70%. And so these transitions have happened. We have a lot better infrastructure today. We have much better education systems. But certainly the need to reskill is something that is going to ripple throughout the world. And it's going to be a tremendous challenge as well. So when it comes to leadership, this is one of those difficult ones to face, right? So now I have too many questions. Let me go ahead and just take the latest one and then believe and walk backwards. Do you believe consciousness is necessary for AGI, or can a machine be generally intelligent without it? So if you notice throughout my whole conversation here, I did not talk about consciousness. And my definition was a system that can learn, that can remember, right? That can reason. So if you think about ChatGPT, you can give it something, right? And it can learn it, that bit of information. You can ask it to reason over it. And you might be able to get some flexibility here when it comes to applying that same reasoning to other domains, right? That's a pretty low bar when it comes to AGI. This is not super intelligence for sure, meaning a collection of these AGIs, and certainly not addressing the question of consciousness. One of the issues that I found when I was looking at this question was that there's no agreement when it comes to consciousness. I'll direct you to some books on the topic in a moment, but the first 100 or 200 pages is just all of the different ways in which you could define consciousness, right? So I'm not touching consciousness. I think that's a little bit too challenging at the moment, or certainly in the context that we're talking about. I'm talking about a simple definition of AGI that is within reach, in that we could make the argument that in some cases we have it. So let me go ahead and go on to the next one. It says, is cognitive intelligence human-like, still differentiated from artificial intelligence agents? And so again, let me point you back to that definition. I don't think I need to say more. I think in that sense, that's how I'm defining it. Let me go ahead and take here Stacy's, and I'll go ahead and read it. If superintelligence emerges, how might an AI self-awareness of its superior intelligence influence its relationship with humanity? Historically, the most intelligent species on Earth has been at the top of the hierarchy. So this is one that, again, within the context of what I am saying, it's out of scope. But I'll go ahead and address it, just because I've heard some interesting arguments around this question. And one of them is the insects versus humans. And that it's not that we wish ill of insects, and I'm not talking here about mosquitoes and these things, I'm talking about insects in general. Mostly we don't think about them, right? If we're going to build a driveway, if we're going to build a home, if we go about a walk, we're not thinking about the insects, right? It is something, there's a intelligence disparity that is so great that we don't even factor that into our considerations, right? And so some have argued that this could happen with AI, that AI becomes so advanced that in carrying out its goals, we're sort of inconsequential, right? We don't matter, in the sense that insects may not matter. Now, in that case, many have brought up the issue of alignment. And alignment is something that many people are taking a look at. And this is a domain in where we cross over from what I have been talking about to philosophy. And there's a big divide there between the scientists, the ones that are doing empirical research, actually touching the code, putting systems into place, and those that are making philosophical arguments around certain concepts. Not that they're not valuable, but I would say that they're quite different. And as Jeffrey Hinton said, it is the engineers that are making the applications, that are seeing the results, that are going to face the problems before anybody else. And I think it is work that it's still out in front of us quite a way. Like I said, we're still trying to become as good as a person, right? One person, not a collection of them. And so I think that's something that I will leave to philosophy for now. But I let me go ahead and give you a link to my books, because I think that that will make it easier. Here, let me see. So just give me a second, and I will post here the link. So let me see if it goes through. Sometimes I'm using a service that collects the streams from several channels, and so I'm not sure if it's posting back. If somebody can give me a thumbs up, if it did post back. If it didn't post back, the address is quite simple. It's able.mit.edu/# So I'll repeat it again. Able, my name, ABEL.mit.edu/# And so there you can get to my books, and you can see that there's books there on alignment, there's books there on super intelligence, there's many books on the topics that we are discussing. So that was a comment by Stacy, and I'm falling way behind here on the questions. If it's just myself, in fact, next time I will probably do Zoom. I think it's easier to field questions, and I can allow you to just unmute yourself, which would make it easier. But let me go ahead and read here the next one. Uh, the AI agent evolution. Oh, so I addressed that one. Let me go ahead and go on to the next one. How is Gen AI, AGI, going to impact the need for professors to teach at MIT, e.g., engineering? So, Andrew, fantastic question, close to my heart. And here, there is an awakening that's going to take place in universities as to how we learn. And this is something that has been playing through in the back of my mind quite a bit over the past year. In many ways, and this is not even just AI, we really don't need to lecture in the way that we have in the past. If you exceed 50 students or so, you no longer have the time in lecture to be able to truly address questions. And so many people have referred to this as flipping the classroom, right? Where you watch the lectures on your own time and then you come to class just to have discussion. So we could have this already, but imagine a university where lecturing is no longer taking place, and it feels a bit odd, right? If you look at most traditional universities, they're still doing lecturing, right? But imagine doing that, flipping the classroom, where your professor is not only lecturing on your own time, but it's answering questions as well. So it's an interactive session. And that professor has been loaded, meaning the artificial one, has been populated with his experience and lectures and notes and problem sets and opinions over the last 20 years. Now imagine that that professor gets augmented, not only his domain set, but others that he recommends as well. And so this this AI professor, let's call him AI professor, has more capabilities than the human counterpart. And that is the one that students are using. So, what is the role then of the traditional university? I'm not talking about doing research. I'm talking here simply as imparting knowledge, right? You come to class and you get a lecture in the traditional university. There, I think we start to make an argument for a very different type of education. And not only that, a much different price point. As some of you might know, the US market has university costs that exceed average salaries in the country, right? So imagine if you have 2 or 3 kids, the type of financial burden that you have. Now imagine if you could get those same professors and, in fact, enhance versions of the same professors for a minimal cost, because now you have a digital version, right? And so this is the type of questions that are coming to university, right? And this is something that, you know, I think at this point I will leave at that. Stephanie says, when will AI start improving itself? And this is think of the traditional system that is out on the roads today and that is that it's trying to detect license plates, right? That you drive a road that is a toll road and you need to be charged for using that road. And so it reads the license plates of cars, right? System that is well established in many countries. Now imagine taking the data of all the license plates that it has read incorrectly and feeding it back into that training, hence improving, right, the accuracy of this algorithm. Now, this type of approach is something that we could see, right, and that you could even build in. However, what we've seen over the past few years is that history doesn't always predict the future, and we know that from our own lives, right? All of the predictive algorithms failed when COVID hit, right? Because we hadn't been in that situation before. And when it comes to many other endeavors in life, in the United States, there was a famous case of a real estate company that, based on its data, started to purchase properties. And it did really well, like fantastically well for a period of time. I think it was 6 months. And then it started to make mistakes and they lost a ton of money, right? And so I think we have that capability already of being able to feed back information and make the algorithm better, but we need oversight. And this comes back to the question of control, right? Of what control systems should we have and what type of alignment with the human should come. But at a very practical level, right? If you implement an algorithm and the world changes and the history of the past is no longer the conditions that you are undergoing at the moment, you will not be able to make an accurate prediction. And so we need human oversight, or we need really good monitoring systems that can alert humans that something is going wrong, in order to be able to leverage that, right? So let me go ahead and move forward. This one comes from Bernardo, and sorry that I'm not keeping up. I know that questions are coming fast. How do you see the current agent applications by smaller companies, Crew AI, LangChain, versus the future of huge companies like OpenAI entering this field? So one of the arguments that OpenAI and other companies have made is that the the importance of innovation, right? And what I mean by that is that systems that you can run and you don't need, $1 billion to be able to spend on specialized hardware, right? Um, and I think we have some of that, right? So the latest models from Meta, for example, are about 1 GB, right? And you can do. I've used them in class, and I've assigned them for homeworks and so on, and you can do some surprising things with these little models. And it all depends on what you are trying to do, right? For many things, you don't need the sophistication of a chat GBT, advanced reasoning type of capabilities. But how far can you push the boundary, and can you maintain this ecosystem accessible to all, is one of the big questions, right? And I think some of that is here at the moment, right? If you look at tools such as Olama, and I believe that is olama.org. Let me go ahead and search for it just to make sure that I'm giving you the right address. Nope, that's not it. Let me see. Olama.com. And so I am not hitting the, in fact, don't go to that address because that looks like it's a spam address. Uh, Here's the address. I'll put it into the chat. It's olama.com. You can spin up any new LLM for all of the LLMs that are public, meaning that anyone can instantiate in seconds, right? At the speed of your bandwidth. If you're familiar with this technology, it's very similar to containers in that all you do is put in a command line of parameters, and you can have a new instance of an SQL database when it comes to containers. And when it comes to LLMs, the same thing is true with this. In fact, it will feel very, very familiar if you're used to containers. And you can instantiate any of these, right? And so given the right resources, and companies like NVIDIA have already promised at CES, the Consumer Electronics show that is in Vegas at the beginning of the year every year, they announced that they will put out a workstation for people to experiment with AI. And this will have the type of capabilities that you can run many of these, in your own four walls and experiment. And so I think there is quite a bit of this at the high end. That is a domain that is limited for those that can afford that kind of hardware. And so in universities, you're not seeing a lot of work in this. And so if you see the advantage that industry has towards university, especially for fundamental models such as these, there's a big disparity with industry. But my hope is that this will become much more democratized, and some of this tooling is doing it already. Okay, let me go ahead and take another one here. This one from Giuseppe. Human plus AI graded in AI today, but on the long run, AI could be slowed down by humans. That's a good point. So I think as we speculate out into the future, could AI learn to do human things better than humans? And this is one, Giuseppe, thank for that, Giuseppe Genovesi, that I think about because I've tried some of the, say, therapist type of AIs, where you have something similar to an LLM, but it's also similar to a session with a psychologist, right? Where it's trying to comfort you, support you. And I got to say that even if you do it as a test, you feel good at the end of the session. Even if you do 10 minutes as an experiment, you feel somehow soothed, you feel lighter, you feel up. And so I wonder, in time, if AI could become better at being human than humans are. And this is something that I won't speculate on, but you could see that some of that might be useful. For example, there is a mental health crisis in the world, and we don't have enough therapists, right? And so, could we develop some of these capabilities and make them available to the world, right, at a very low cost or perhaps even free? And this is something certainly that would be beneficial, right? Of course, it would be better to have a human, but if a person can't get a human, this might even be life-saving in a crisis. And so what is that balance? How do we keep on going back to the alignment question, and here I'll point back to my books that I recommended, right, for some of that literature and some of that context. But this is something that I think over time, certain aspects of humanity might be done quite well by machines, but that's just speculation, right? Remember, today I have a very conservative definition of AGI, right? Can this system remember something? Can this system reason over that something that it remembers? And could this be applied to something else or the problem in hand? That's a very low bar. And this is why, I raised the question of, is AGI here, and how will we adapt to those capabilities? Because even those capabilities, right, which I think many of you who use AI, I think would agree that it's quite conservative, could already revolutionize how we do many things. I talked about the example of university, right? And I talked about how this could be transformed. The capabilities that I'm talking about are defined within that AGI, that very low bar AGI, right? And so I know it's fun to project, right, and say, could we have friends that are better than human friends, that are AI friends? And I'm not going to go there, as I said, but I did bring up the example of the therapist, right? So let me take the next one here. I'm just going in order from, I think Stacy was the second or third, and so I'm just working my way down the list here. And it says, Maria Victoria Manoni, do you see any emerging capabilities from the future hybrid teams and of human plus AI and challenges? So emerging capabilities are, for those of you who are not familiar with system theory, are bringing the pieces together and getting more than the pieces themselves can do, right? And so oftentimes a clock is is shown as this. You have a bunch of gears that together could do a few things, but you bring all of these different pieces together and you might get something that can tell time, right? So these emerging capabilities when it comes to humans and I think one of the things that we can do at the moment better than AI is that we can think laterally better. And not only that, we have a lot of curiosities and sort of inner compasses that point in many different directions. And so we weren't developed to do one task. And so when you have a human that has those properties, right, and you have a system that has been specialized to carry out some task, then obviously over time you would get insights by the human of how to use it differently, how to explore new opportunities. And so I think we do get that. The emerging capabilities or the emerging threats are those that I mentioned in the past. That if we're basing our predictions on the past doesn't always predict the future. And so because of it, we're going to have scenarios in where there are different conditions and where the prediction will fail. And so how do we address that is a challenge. And of course, when we think about scenarios in where we have very high stakes, for example, consider a judge, right, that is sentencing a person to go to jail or be released. And many people say there could be a more fair system if you get a judge that is impartial, right? But at the same time, could you get here scenarios or conditions and where that prediction is not necessarily true, right? Because people can change their ways. And just because they have a certain history doesn't mean that the prediction is 100% sure, 100% accuracy, right? Even if it's 99%, right? Many of you, I think, would argue that you should give that person the opportunity, right? Otherwise we're in Minority Report, right? Where whatever the machines predict will happen and there's no escaping it. And so those are some of the scenarios I think where we could have some challenges, and how do we do alignment? How do we do this pairing, right, of human and machine in a fair way is one of the big questions, right? So what do we see for AI trends? I think that's an easy one. Agents and the context of what we have been speaking is the big one. Let me take here another one that says, when humanity does not understand something and rejects it, that is why it applies regulations. This is what is happening with the issue of artificial intelligence. Will it be necessary for humanity to understand the use of technology to be able to accept it? So many of us, and I would argue societies and nations, have a certain tolerance for change. And if you push it beyond that, you destabilize society. And here I would point you to the book of The Narrow Divide, right? Of that balance between a state that is strong and has stability and the demands of people for accountability in that strong government, right? And this is something that evolves over time and that societies take a long time in reaching, right? You've seen many countries in where a certain government has tried to be imposed onto it that are not really ready for that type of government, and the evolution that they might go through, or that many go through because it's not the same history for everyone, is something that you need to travel. And so when it comes to the type of regulations that we might have, I think it's not the same for everybody. And educating people is part of it. I think we certainly need that. But there's also a different reaction that many people have to change. And this comes again from the world of research. And there are two groups of people: those that want to push on the boundaries, and those that want to retain what we have. And this is often referred to as conservative and progressive, right? Typically, people in university have been more progressive, right? They want to change the world faster than the world is ready to go through that change. And in many ways, this is why you hear the expressions of the crazy professor, right, that is trying to propose something that many people think doesn't make any sense, right? Um, but it turns out that in society we have the same, and in our companies we have the same. And there's an advantage here for those that want to stop change. And the advantage that they have is that most new ideas don't work. So think about your workplace, your organization, your university, and think about all the new proposals that are made. And think about how many of those fail, right? And the reality is that most of the new things that we try don't work. But amongst all of those, there's also the diamonds that will revolutionize education, that will change the world, that will, for example, bring higher yields to agriculture, that will improve our lives in many ways. The germ theory of disease that, if you look, you don't have to look back that far, and the, average lifespan was, below 30 years old. And that's, today in many countries around the world is well over 70, right? And so these were changes that rocked us to our foundation, and we certainly went through them. But that struggle needs to be recognized. And so if you're thinking at it from the perspective of government, of the perspective of organizations, this is something that needs to be understood. And the world of software has many lessons for this type of approach. And those lessons are that we must fail fast, we must work in small steps, and there's a good history there. And so if you're not familiar with some of this context, um, you're welcome to sign up to one of my courses that talks about this. The one on DevOps talks about this perhaps the most. Those of you who have taken my courses know that this is something that we talk about quite often. And so I think all of these are necessary parts of this change. We can't be binary. Okay, we're going to go all in, because we've seen massive failures from that as well, and GE being one of the most notable ones. And if you want more books on GE's failures, again, able.mit.edu/pound/books. And I have a book there about some of the failures of GE. And so I talked a lot about that one. Thank you for that question. Um, and Manoj asks, how much will the instance of the software engineer cost? This is a fascinating question, right? I don't know how much they're charging. I can tell you that, for example, the bots that are supporting you on writing code, I think they run around $20 a month. And this is the equivalent of having pair programming. For those of you who are not technical, there is a practice of doing pair programming, which is as it sounds. Instead of having one person, you have two. It turns out that a single person typically makes so many mistakes that it's worth having a full other person next to them to be able to improve the code that they produce. And that's still advantageous, meaning economically it makes sense, right? And so if you get the equivalent of a pair programmer looking over your code, and it only costs $20 a month, for the subscription, it's a pretty good deal, right? That system, which is in place in several platforms. I know uh, Google has one. I know Amazon has one. I know the one from GitHub is called Copilot. This is the one that I use and I use in class. Is surprisingly good, right? Meaning that I don't want to write software without it, right? And most people that I know won't go back. They say there's no reason. It doesn't make any sense. And if you think about pretty much any task that we do as humans, there are those parts of it that you go, okay, I'm just wasting my time. Anybody could do this. It doesn't need my expertise, right? And those are prime candidates for that level of automation. When it comes to software, even something as complex as writing code, there's many of those parts, right? So the architecture, I would argue, still needs to come from the human, although those capabilities will come in time. But the filling in of the details, the function that has been written thousands of times before, if you are good at describing what you're going to do, and this, by the way, is one of the abilities that you need to develop as you guide AI, is good communication skills, then AI will fill in that work for you. Okay, so let's go ahead and go on to another one. Um, do you believe in conscious? Do you believe consciousness? So I'm going to skip that one because I talked about consciousness. Is cognitive intelligence human-like, still differentiated from artificial intelligence agents? This I will put back into the superintelligence, the consciousness type of questions. Stacy, another question. If superintelligence emerges, how might AI self-awareness of its superiors? I think, let me see. Maybe I'm back to the old questions. I think this question was asked before. Let me take this one from Andy. The policy for first motorized car in UK with a person in front waving was interesting. Yeah, I had to laugh at that, especially the pictures that I saw. And by the way, we have about 5 minutes left. Pointing to this policy, mentally differences. Do you think the differences in Western countries, US, EU, relative to China, will impede AGI progress? Whether yes or no, what should we do to avoid falling behind? So I will avoid the politics as I tend to do, but I do think that countries are now competing in the field of AI, meaning when it comes to military technology, when it comes to innovation within countries, and products, when it comes to manufacturing, when it comes to logistics, when it comes to even the creative side of industries. AI is now AI development and adoption of the population is one of the key differentiators. And so, how do we avoid falling behind? Education and reskilling is the big part of it. And reskilling is a risk in many places because we saw it before with manufacturing class, right? As manufacturing left the US, many of the problems that emerged from it, in many ways, some would argue that the emergence of populism, at least in the US, was influenced by this. But again, I'll stay away from the politics. Um, but certainly, this is now a skill set that we need to compete in the marketplace, that we need to compete within our organizations, that we need to compete nation to nation. And so that investment needs to come, that accessibility needs to come because we're still dealing with the digital divide. And now we're going to have a divide that's even bigger. Remember, human plus AI against human, it's going to be no competition, right? Because if you can produce a report in a tenth of the time, if you can get your job done in half of the time, imagine what this will mean for those that are competing without it, right? And so certainly this is something that I think if we don't want it to be a crisis, is something that needs to start now. And I know, of course, the challenge is how do we work with our educational systems, especially our public education systems. But again, I won't get into the politics. I'll simply say that this is something that needs to be done now. Even let me give you an example of the type of challenge that exists. In the United States, there is a ranking per state. There are 50 states, right? And Massachusetts, the state that MIT is in, is ranked number one. Even within the state, the top ranked schools, if you look at the level of computer science classes that they offer, they are quite poor, right? And a lot of that has to do with the infrastructure, it has to do with the training, it has to do with the reward system that exists, the challenges of teaching in this environment. So now that we face an even bigger, stretch, you can imagine the type of challenges that would exist. And that is in a country that has, great resources, that spends more than anybody in the world when it comes per student, even though it only performs at around, in mathematics and other fields, at around 30 something, right? This is a challenge that the country needs to face. Who's doing great things? As usual, Scandinavian countries have interesting pilots going on, especially around the challenges of misinformation. And so I'm going to go ahead and take this last question, but then I'll go ahead and stop. This will be the end of the stream, to try to end on a more positive note. I just talked about the challenges, and that could be perceived as negative. But thank you all for your attention. Thank you for all the questions. Sorry that I couldn't take more. Time just sort of flies when you're answering questions. And the last question that I will take here is around the problem of cybersecurity. It's certainly, this is a double-edged sword, right? There's a lot more creativity in the adversaries, but then there's a tremendously new field for new companies emerging in this domain. And I've seen a number of them come online in the last year. If you want to hear from some of those founders, A16Z, the Anderson Horowitz venture capitalist firm, has a number of these founders talking about some of these challenges. The CIO, I'm not sure if it's CIO or CTO of the CIA, the American Intelligence Agency, is also on there talking about the opportunities and some of the challenges. And I think on the upside, I come back to what I was mentioning before. This is an opportunity across nations, across the world, across agencies, right? When it comes to how to leverage it. And in the case of cybersecurity, there's a huge incentive here because the adversaries are certainly already leveraging it. So I think there's a tremendous opportunity. AGI should make our lives easier. Being able to leverage those new agents that come online, I think will teach us a lot in the next year. And so I think at that very low bar that I talked about when it comes to AGI, we are here in the sense of we have these capabilities. And it's now up to us to educate, to reskill, to be able to integrate it into our organizations. So thanks for your attention. Thank you for your questions. I'll go ahead and end the stream there, and I'll see you in our next one.